Tonight we are addressing the questions many of you have been asking since the big quake hit. Just how safe are our buildings? And could lives have been saved? We've seen what the 6.3 quake did to Christchurch, but it's not just the garden city that's vulnerable. The capital, last night, shaken by a 4.5 magnitude tremor. There is a long list in that city of at-risk buildings. Now, shortly, the Minister in charge fronts up, but first, Johan Casanada with this report.
For a city that's been expecting the big one for years, you'd think the capital is ready for a good, strong shake. But now the city's facing a multi-million-dollar headache, with major properties needing to be made more quake-proof.
We're estimating at this point, and it's only an estimate, that there'd be somewhere between 600 to 700 by the time the review's finished.
So if there's a quake, you'd at least expect the emergency services to have it covered. But here's the fire station behind me, and believe it or not, it's not fully quake-proof. The fire service says the work will be done by the end of the year. Almost 4,000 buildings in the region have been checked by the council. More than 100 have been served with notices saying they need critical strengthening work. The council's been trying to coax property owners to get the work done, but some say it'll cost too much and they aren't being given enough time to do it. Originally, property owners were given between 5 and 15 years to re-strengthen their buildings. Now that's been pushed out by 5 years at each level. Even property developer Ian Castles says it's a problem.
I agree with you. I think 20 years sounds too long. I think it could be done faster.
We're not just talking about old Victorian clunkers here. We're talking about a whole host of new buildings, including office blocks, nightclubs and cafes.
So I certainly wouldn't go into any buildings now.
Just take my chances, really.
If a building is earthquake prone, it doesn't mean that it's dangerous. It just means that it's more likely to suffer damage in the event of a moderate earthquake.
OK, but for all the buildings in the capital, the Wellington City Council, the people who will lead us in the event of a quake, surely that building must be pretty safe? Well, think again. It's also on the list.
The council is looking quite closely at the moment at how it can strengthen its building in a very short period of time.
Big events in Wellington can be 800 years apart. So you've got to fix it, but you've got to fix it in a rational and organised way.
The Creative New Zealand building, owned by Queen Elizabeth no less, another property that's on the list. The owners of these buildings are required to display a notice in their foyer saying the council has told them that the building needs work. This building doesn't have one.
It's an individual's choice as to where they live and whether they walk into a building or not walk into a building. Critical thing is that they understand what it means to be earthquake prone. An earthquake prone building does not mean it is instantly dangerous.
If these buildings aren't fixed, they too could be demolished. But with 10, 15 or even 20 years to fix them, the property owners have plenty of time. But there's also plenty of time for a big quake.
That's Wellington. Now let's turn our attention to the city. For years, we discover scientists have been looking at the vulnerability of many of the buildings in the CBD here and the need for strengthening. We'll talk to the Minister about that shortly, but first though, Michael Holland talks to Stefano Pampanin, the Associate Professor of Structural Engineering at the University of Canterbury. One person who was not entirely surprised to learn Christchurch had crumbled after last week's jolt.
He's an international authority on earthquake engineering who's led research at Canterbury University for the last decade. Included in that research, studies which have warned of the vulnerability of 60s and 70s buildings such as the CTV and Pine Gould Towers.
We have to accept that there is a probability of collapse which was very high for older buildings and is becoming lower and lower for modern building. Just to get the understanding of that, there is one chance out of a big number that even a brand new design building today can collapse under an earthquake. There was a higher chance, much higher chance, the more we go back in the past, that buildings like CTV and PGC could have collapsed.
Modern buildings have more flex in them.
Correct. Modern buildings have been designed according to a completely different philosophy in the ages. So we have been moving from what was called a brittle behavior. You imagine glass. If you go over the strength of glass, you break in a very bad manner. But if you have a system capable of moving back and forth, it's called ductile. That concept completely changed the way of doing. So if a building was capable of sustaining a big movement, then ideally, there will be no earthquake capable of taking that down.
Ductile buildings now are as safe as they can be?
Not by definition. Ductile buildings are safer as we know they could be within our knowledge. In 50 years from now, they will be safer. And we are working with new generation of technology.
Your confidence in the new building codes if there was to be an earthquake of a similar magnitude?
We can easily have a magnitude 5 underneath our feet right now, and things can be in trouble. But the new code is easily taking that type of, again, earthquake. It can easily take that without having absolutely collapse or absolutely life safety. But damage is going to be expected.
The city could have been flattened.
The city could have been, no, I'm not saying all down, but could have much severe damage in a more extended area.
The only certainty about earthquakes, their uncertainty. And that, says this expert, is why scientists and regulators must constantly work together to improve building and safety standards.
So, have the politicians been listening? Have they been talking to each other? Building and Construction Minister Maurice Williamson has been listening to those reports. He joins me now. Minister, were you aware of reports about vulnerability?
Mark, before I say anything, I just want to say that my thoughts are with the people of Christchurch, and particularly those who have lost loved ones. And I toured the city yesterday, and what I saw will leave an indelible mark on me forever. And I also want to pay a huge tribute to the teams that are working in the recovery and the rescue. It's both New Zealanders doing unbelievable work, but the huge number of foreigners. I want to say that before I start. Yes, I've been aware that the building code has been an evolutionary process, and it's underpinned by a pretty inexact science. We don't know everything about seismic science. We know a lot more now than we knew, and the building code has been progressively reformed. And I think your professor is dead right. Buildings built now under the code will withstand very, very large shakes, as did the IRD building straight across the road from the CTV building in Canterbury. The issue now is, what do we do with buildings that were built under previous codes and old buildings, and how much re-strengthening do we have to do, and make sure we do that so it's economically viable and that we don't send the place bankrupt in doing so.
With respect, Minister, you say it's an issue now. Surely it was an issue back in September. It's been an issue for years before that. This is not something we've just discovered today. No, I didn't say that. I said we've been progressively refining the building code. We did it in many different years. There's been an update of the code as the engineers have been able to come up with new things like flexible technologies and ductile type designs. That code will continue to evolve over time. But I will tell you, Mark, that it's recognised New Zealand is at the very forefront of building techniques within seismic strengthening, and any buildings built under the current code are world class. We're invited to seminars around the world to tell them about our code and our standards, and that makes me very pleased with where we are. The difficulty now we'll have to do is face how do you impose some of that retrofitting on some of the older buildings that have been deemed to be an earthquake risk. Minister, as someone who spends a lot of time in Wellington, we saw in Jahan's report there are still buildings deemed high risk and they've been given a 5-year extension. Isn't that a gamble with people's lives? Well, the way the Act works, the Building Act was put in place and it's made local authorities responsible for, first of all, looking at all the buildings in their stock. And it's important that local authorities do it because you need a different regime based on the earthquake risk of where you are. Just like when we have a snow loading regime for buildings, we don't do the same in Northland as we do in Southland for obvious reasons. We don't put the same requirements on people based on the whole country having one standard. But Wellington City Council have an obligation under the Act to look at all their buildings, to work out which ones are earthquake prone, and then to put in place a management regime that will actually see those buildings strengthened. Now, one of the things that I think will come out of the inquiry into the PGC and the CTV building will be whether, in fact, a national-type regime for strengthening that process needs to be put in place. I'm still quite keen to leave it with local authorities because there is such variation across the country. So, I mean, look, we talk about the 5-year extension. You work out of the Beehive, one of the safest buildings in the country, because the taxpayer funded the retrofitting to make it safe. Are you happy that the rest of Wellingtonians have to wait maybe another 5 years before they get the same protection?
I don't think it's to do with the building I work in or not, Mark. I live in an apartment that I don't know whether that is safe or not. I think it's the policy that's important. There are buildings identified as earthquake prone. The local authorities have to put in place a management regime to do it. Wellington Council have chosen, for their own reasons, and they'll have to explain those, to put that 5-year extension. It'll be to do with the economic viability. You see, if you put too much onus on the buildings having to be brought to a standard too quickly, you make those buildings uneconomic and you could send the nation bankrupt. On the other hand, it has to be done, and it's a balance, and I think your professor said that. It's very much about getting that balance right.
Minister, what could drive the country bankrupt is another major earthquake. I mean, we're going to be suffering over the cost here in Christchurch. Surely it is cheaper in the end, both in human cost and in terms of the economy, to fix the buildings now.
Well, of course, that's taken into account at the time, and you're right. If the retrofit of a building is reasonably economically viable to get done and in a proper time frame, then it should be done, and it should be done quickly. But you are looking at a very, very large range of building ages, from buildings that are 100 years old and so on. There were no building codes for seismic activity. They didn't come in until after the 1931 Napier earthquake. And to go back and do every one of those has a price tag that may be really unsustainable based on their risk. So it's got to be a risk-based system, work out what buildings are at risk, work out what needs to be done, and then put a regime in place to get that done. Now, that was actually brought in the Building Act of 2004, and local councils are this year. Nearly all councils involved in that very process.
Minister, does someone need to step up and bang some heads together over this? We heard Professor Pampanin saying, look, the scientists and the government aren't talking enough. Do you need to be that person? Do you need to get in there and make something happen?
Well, there will clearly be some very specific roadmaps come out of the various inquiries that are following from what happened in Christchurch, and there will be some decisions. But I repeat again, the building code is evolutionary. There will be the next phase, and then the next phase after it. You will never get to a final building code, but we are at the world-class standard for our new buildings, and new buildings fared very well in this quake, and that is recognised. And well, now it comes back to how fast and how severe do you need to be with a regime to retrofit old buildings, and they are very expensive in many cases. We mandatorily force buildings to retrofit fire sprinklers because that doesn't cost a lot. But to go back and mandatorily refit earthquakes to the standard of today in an old rigid building, it often means the building just can't be, it's just not viable.
Minister, can I suggest, I mean, it's particularly for Wellingtonians or anyone who lives in a quake-prone area, if there was another quake there, people would be looking at the government and saying, you've been talking about policy and forgetting about lives.
Well, no, we're not forgetting about lives, Mark. The whole building code is centred around buildings performing to save lives. If you take the Hotel Grand Chancellor in Christchurch, it did exactly what we want from a building code. Yes, the building is damaged badly, but that is not what the building code is about. It's about performing so that people can get out safely with their lives, even if in the end of it the building is damaged. I think we're very much focused on lives. I think the upgrades to the building code with seismic activity in 2008 strengthen it even more. We will learn some more lessons out of it. There's some real lessons about vertical shaking that we have never had before to learn, and some stuff about liquefaction we've never had. But this will be an ongoing process, well informed by some of the research, but it isn't an exact science.
Minister, Maurice, Williamson, we appreciate your time tonight. We look forward to what they do come up with in that inquiry.